The first sound that cracked through the still air was the gavel. 3 sharp strikes, each louder than the last, sent vibrations running along the marble walls of the courtroom. Dust rose from the polished wood where the hammer had landed, hanging in the shaft of yellow light spilling from the lamps above. Every head in the gallery jerked slightly, some out of fear, some out of habit. Judge Harold Whittaker leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, his black robe falling in stiff folds around him. His pale skin looked almost translucent under the unforgiving light, and his grey eyes, cold and metallic, scanned the papers before him, rather than the people standing in his courtroom. "Sit down," he barked suddenly, the words snapping like a whip. "In my court, those who don't understand respect will be taught respect." The defendant, Devin Reeves, a 26-year-old black man in a wrinkled white shirt, froze in disbelief. His jaw tightened, his shoulders locked, but he refused to lower his gaze. The bailiff at his side pressed him down into the chair with a heavy hand, as if reminding him of his place. Whittaker barely acknowledged the exchange, his voice steady and unyielding as he read from the file. Charges: obstruction of justice, failure to comply, disorderly conduct. Sentence: 90 days in the county jail. The words fell like a stone into still water, rippling through every soul present. Gasps rose from the gallery. A woman's cry cut through the stunned silence. Devin's mother, sitting rigid in the back row, clutching a handkerchief already wet with tears. 90 days? For a traffic stop? Please, he didn't do anything. Her plea was silenced instantly by the gavel. Whittaker's face flushed red as he thundered, "Silence! One more outburst, and I will have you removed from this courtroom." The room obeyed, cowed by the force of his authority. Devin's mother buried her face in her hands, sobs muffled but still audible, raw anguish echoing through the chamber. Devin's own voice cracked as he turned toward the judge. 90 days? I didn't do anything. This isn't fair." The bailiff snapped cold cuffs around his wrists, the metallic click echoing louder than it should have, and began to drag him away. Devin struggled, but the chains of justice, heavy and symbolic, clinked with each forced step toward the side door. His mother reached for him, but was intercepted by another officer, her desperate fingers clawing at empty air. At the back of the courtroom, a man sat utterly still. Elias Carter. Mid-40s, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark suit immaculate, his polished shoes gleaming even in the dim light. A leather briefcase rested neatly at his side, the initials EC embossed in gold. His face betrayed nothing, but his eyes remained fixed on Whittaker with an intensity sharp enough to cut glass. His jaw was clenched tight, one hand gripping the armrest of his chair so firmly that his knuckles blanched. 90 days. For words spoken in frustration. For raising his voice in the wrong room, he thought. Whittaker calls it discipline. I call it something else. Bias, sharpened into a weapon. The gavel fell once more, and with it, Whittaker's voice droned as he moved to the next case, as if Devin Reeves's life had been brushed aside, just another file closed, just another number added to his tally. The machinery of his courtroom ground on, indifferent to the humanity it crushed beneath its gears. Elias rose quietly, the leather of his chair creaking in protest. He lifted his briefcase, his posture calm, but the fire in his eyes betrayed the storm brewing within. His footsteps echoed through the chamber as he slipped out the heavy wooden door. The hallway outside was dim, lined with portraits of judges long dead, their painted eyes following him, their stern faces cast in shadow. Tradition stared down at him from every gilded frame, a reminder that this system had survived for centuries, unchallenged, unbroken. He walked until he stood before a large mirror hanging on the wall. His reflection looked back, clean lines of his suit, the tired determination etched into his brow, the weight of 15 years in prosecution pressing into his shoulders. For a long moment he said nothing, only stared at the man in the glass. Then, quietly, his thoughts crystallized into words. Justice, if it exists at all. Tonight it hides behind this glass. Behind every number I've studied, every sentence I've seen twisted. I can't keep standing here, briefcase in hand, while men like Whitaker turn the law into a hammer. If the system refuses to expose itself, then I must walk into it, not as a prosecutor, not anymore, but as prey. His hand rose, fingertips brushing the surface of the mirror. A faint smudge marked the glass where his skin met the reflection, a scar upon the illusion. His phone buzzed in his pocket, dragging him from his trance. He pulled it free, glancing at the glowing screen. A message? Nomination vote for Whitaker. Thursday. Elias exhaled, the breath long, controlled, carrying the weight of a decision he had already made. Whitaker's star was rising, his promotion inevitable. Unless someone stopped him. Unless someone showed the world what happened inside this courtroom when no one was willing to challenge the man with the hammer. Elias slid the phone back into his pocket. His reflection still stared back, half in shadow, half in light. A man divided by duty and by conscience. But there was no more hesitation. He straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and whispered under his breath, "Tyrants don't fall because they grow tired. They fall because someone decides to stop standing silent." His footsteps echoed once again as he strode down the long hallway, past the portraits, past the marble pillars, past the silent echoes of history. Outside, the night waited for him, heavy with the promise of storms. The city outside had gone quiet by the time Elias Carter stepped into his office. The glow of street lamps bled through the tall windows, casting pale rectangles across the floor. The room smelled faintly of coffee gone cold and paper left too long under fluorescent light. On his desk sat 3 cardboard boxes stacked high, their edges frayed from years of handling. They looked ordinary, yet inside them lay 15 years of whispered suspicions given form. Judge Harold Whitaker's sentencing records. Elias shrugged off his coat and loosened his tie, the day's weight pressing down on him. He rubbed his eyes once, then leaned against the desk. For a long moment, he simply stared at the boxes, as if they might open themselves and spill out the truth without his hand. But truth never volunteered. It had to be dragged out, clawed from shadows. He reached for the first file just as a knock sounded on the door. "Come in," he called, his voice low but firm. The door creaked open, and Dr. Naomi Park stepped in. Petite, sharp-eyed, carrying a laptop tucked under one arm and a stack of binders under the other. Her dark hair was tied back severely, her glasses perched low on her nose. "You're still here?" she observed, though it wasn't a question. "Of course I am," Elias replied, allowing himself a faint smile. "Someone has to keep the lights on." She set her binders down on the table, exhaling with relief. "Then it's a good thing I brought evidence strong enough to light up this whole city." She flipped open her laptop, the screen's glow illuminating her face. Rows of numbers filled the display, tidy columns of names, dates, charges, and sentences. Elias pulled a chair closer, leaning in. "Tell me what I'm looking at." Naomi adjusted her glasses. "I cross-referenced every sentencing record from Whitaker's court since his appointment. That's nearly 15 years, thousands of cases. Then I controlled for variables, age, prior offences, type of crime, plea bargains. The disparities, they're staggering." She clicked a key. A bar graph appeared, stark red and blue lines rising unevenly. For defendants of colour, sentences averaged 35 to 45% longer than for white defendants convicted of identical crimes with similar records. In some categories, drug possession, minor assault, the disparity climbs past 50. Elias exhaled slowly. "So it's not just perception?" "No," Naomi said firmly. "It's surgical. Consistent across years, across categories. This isn't unconscious bias. It's a pattern." Elias leaned back, eyes narrowing at the screen. "And what about appeals?" Naomi hesitated, scrolling down. Out of hundreds of cases appealed, very few were overturned. And those that were, almost all involved white defendants. The appellate court defers heavily to judicial discretion. It shields him. Elias's jaw tightened, so he's built himself a fortress. A system within the system. Naomi studied him. Elias, this is dynamite. But numbers alone won't take down a judge. They'll call it cherry-picking, claim there were mitigating factors we overlooked. If you want to end him, you need something more. Elias turned from the laptop, staring out the window at the city lights scattered like embers across the dark. Statistics prove the disease, he murmured, but the world won't listen to charts. They need a body, a story they can't ignore. For a moment, silence settled, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner. Then Naomi asked quietly, "So what's your plan?" Elias faced her, his eyes burning with something colder than anger. "The truth is in those numbers, but I need to walk into Whitaker's courtroom and force him to reveal himself, on record, for everyone to see." Naomi frowned. "That's not a plan, Elias. That's suicide. He has decades of experience humiliating attorneys in open court. You think you can just stroll in and bait him?" "Not as a prosecutor," Elias said, almost to himself. His gaze returned to the mirror of the window, his reflection superimposed against the skyline. "As a defendant." Naomi's head snapped up. "You can't be serious." Elias didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. Naomi shook her head, her voice urgent. "Do you have any idea what you're suggesting? If you get yourself arrested deliberately, you risk everything. Your career, your reputation, maybe even your freedom. One wrong move and you're not exposing Whitaker. You're handing him your head on a platter." Elias's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, humorless and grim. "Then I'll just have to make sure I give him the exact platter I want him to use." He won't be able to resist. Naomi slammed the laptop shut, frustration spilling over. "Elias, these numbers should be enough. With my analysis, with expert testimony, they'll bury it." Elias cut her off, his voice calm but absolute. "They'll say the data is flawed, that context matters, that judges have discretion. They'll debate until the air runs out of the room. Meanwhile, Whitaker will sit on an appellate bench, untouchable." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I don't want a debate. I want evidence that burns." Naomi stared at him, her expression softening into something that looked like fear. "You've always been reckless," she said quietly, "but this is different." Elias stood, picking up one of the thick case files from the box. He flipped it open to a mugshot of a young black man, barely older than Devon Reeves. The sentence scrawled in neat handwriting. 2 years, possession of marijuana. Beneath it, a nearly identical case, a white defendant, same charge, same quantity. Probation, community service. Elias closed the file, his fingers tightening on the cardboard cover. "Different is exactly what it needs to be," he said. Naomi gathered her binders, her face etched with resignation. "If you're going down this road, at least promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Don't make me be the one who testifies about your sanity after the fact." For the first time that night, Elias chuckled softly, though it was without joy. "Noted." She paused at the door, looking back at him. "Be careful, Elias. Statistics don't lie, but people do. And Whitaker's built his life on that truth." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving the office heavy with silence once more. Elias stood in the center of the room, surrounded by stacks of files, the weight of 15 years pressing in. He opened another folder, then another, and another. Each one told the same story in different words. Harsher sentences, longer terms, shattered lives. At last, he pushed the files aside, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling. Numbers don't lie, he thought. But lies don't fall to numbers. They fall to spectacle, to truth no one can deny once they see it with their own eyes. His phone buzzed again. Another message, this one from his deputy. Rumor. Whitaker's appellate nomination vote is moving up. Could be days. Elias closed his eyes, the decision solidifying like steel. The timeline had tightened. So would his plan. The camera of imagination pulled back, rising above his office, where light glowed in a single window against the dark city skyline. Alone at his desk, Elias Carter was already setting in motion the first steps of a plan that would shake the foundations of the courthouse. Night settled over the city like a closing argument as Elias Carter walked the narrow corridor from the elevator to the evidence room, counting the seconds between the hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft click of his heels on tile, letting the rhythm steady his pulse while the plan finished hardening in his mind. By the time he shoulder-pushed through the heavy door and flicked the switch, the vow he'd made in the courtroom, to step inside the machine as prey, was no longer a provocation he whispered to Glass, but a route with mile markers and exits he could not take. He pulled a battered ledger from the third shelf, the one that tracked intake patterns for Whitaker's district, and traced the columns with his finger until he arrived at the section circled in red pencil weeks ago. Traffic stops upgraded for non-compliance during evening shifts along the East Precinct corridor. The line that connected everything he needed was right there. Low-level violation escalates to failure to comply. Add disorderly conduct. And if the defendant argues, the bailiff will note aggressive posture. A trifecta that placed the accused directly onto Whitaker's docket for rapid arraignment. It has to be clean, he murmured, as if the ledger might argue back. No collateral. No real victims. Just enough rope for him to show his hand. The door behind him creaked, and Maya Delgado slipped inside, her dark hair twisted into a knot, her eyes bright with that mix of loyalty and alarm he had come to rely on. "You're not sleeping," she said, closing the door with her hip. "Neither are you," he replied, returning the ledger to its slot. She considered him for a beat, then folded her arms. "Naomi called me. She said, you're planning something reckless and brilliant in that order." Elias offered a slanted smile. "She knows me too well." Maya stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Before you tell me, you should know the nomination committee moved Whitaker's vote. Rumor is they want it on Thursday, late afternoon. That gives you, 2 days to bring the sun down?" He checked the time. The second hand carved the night into disciplined ticks. "Then Thursday morning," he said simply. "In his courtroom, on his terms, with every camera he can't control." Her chin lifted, the tiniest flare of admiration piercing her worry. "How?" "I need a stop in his jurisdiction that looks routine until he makes it something else," Elias said. "A tail light, a rolling stop, anything plausible. From there, the script writes itself. I object politely, I ask questions he'll hear as challenges. The officer escalates. The charges assemble themselves. By 10:30 a.m., I'm standing at his lectern." Maya's mouth pressed into a line. "You're describing entrapment if you push it." "Entrapment is inducing a crime," he said, calm as if he were dictating a memo. "I won't commit one. I will comply with the law, and he will create the crime he expects to see, because that's what he does when the defendant looks like me." She held his gaze. "You're betting your career on his predictability." "No," Elias said. "I'm betting on his pride." He crossed to the long steel table, sliding open a drawer, producing an envelope stamped with the crest of the state Supreme Court. Inside, crisp papers lay like stacked thunderheads. Maya blinked. "What is that?" "Insurance," he said. "A provisional suspension order, unsigned but prepared, awaiting real-time evidence of systematic rights violations. I've been building the case for months. If he bites the way I think he will, the Chief Justice will have everything she needs by mid-morning." Maya let out a breath that sounded like a laugh too tired to stand. "You really do like to build the bridge while you're running across it." "Find me a better way," he said softly. She didn't. Instead, she pulled a small notebook from her pocket and clicked her pen. "Okay, logistics. You need an officer who isn't in on it, a stop that is plausible, and documentation we can authenticate. Audio? Everywhere," Elias said. "Body cam, dash cam, courthouse AV, and me." He tapped his tie. "Microphone stitched beneath the seam. linked to a recorder that uploads to a secure server as it rolls. If something goes sideways, the file doesn't die with me. She scribbled, then looked up. And the moment of reveal? You can't blow cover too early, or he'll pause, reset, perform for the record. Exactly, Elias said. I keep my head down. I speak little. I accept his interruptions. When he pronounces the sentence, something disproportionate and theatrical, I identify myself on the record, present credentials, and notify him of the active investigation. The cameras take care of the rest. Maya closed the notebook, then opened it again, as if the act might change the facts. You'll need a trigger, something he can't resist escalating. Respect, Elias said, almost a whisper. He pleases tone as if it were statute. He hears a raised voice and calls it menace. He sees steady eye contact and calls it defiance. All I have to do is exist in his courtroom with a spine. The words hung there. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Maya nodded once. I'll clear the decks. Thursday morning, your docket is empty. I'll be unavailable but nearby. If you need to hand me the torch, you say the word. He searched her face. If this works, I may not be holding anything by afternoon. Then I will, she said. She reached for the envelope and tapped it twice, as if sealing a pact. One more thing. Do not let him see satisfaction. Make him believe you are the defendant he's scripted 1,000 times. He lifted his briefcase. If there's one role I've studied my entire life, it's that. The next day bloomed grey and mean, the kind of morning that made the city look like it had stayed up too late with its regrets. Elias parked a few blocks from the East Corridor, where evening reports showed the most escalations, then walked past a row of shuttered storefronts until he reached the corner with the blinking yellow light. He adjusted his tie, checked the invisible stitch that hid the mic, and inhaled, letting the breath expand the cage of his ribs until it hurt. A patrol car rolled into view, idling at the curb. He stepped off the corner at the crosswalk just as the light shifted, then stopped abruptly, feigning confusion, the kind that makes officers check twice. The cruiser's door opened. Sir, the officer called, neutral tone taut as a wired fence. Can I see some ID? Elias looked up, composed. Of course, officer. He produced his license, steady hands, eyes down. The officer glanced from the plastic to Elias's face and back. You aware you failed to yield back there? I thought I had the right of way, Elias said, even and polite. The officer's jaw worked. Step over here. The request was reasonable. The stance wasn't. Elias stepped where directed, hands visible, voice low. Is there a problem? The second officer approached, already bristling, as if the scene had been briefed with a word Elias could not hear. Hands on the hood. Elias complied. The metal was cold. Time narrowed to the rectangle of sky between two buildings. Do you consent to a search? No, officer, Elias said, meeting the question with a right he had spent 15 years defending. The air changed pressure. What's with the attitude? The second officer snapped. No attitude, Elias said, still calm. Just exercising my rights. You refusing lawful orders? I've complied with every order. The cuffs appeared like punctuation at the end of a sentence written long before Elias stepped onto the street. Metal kissed bone. Somewhere, the first officer's body cam chimed as it bookmarked the moment. The intake desk at the precinct smelled of disinfectant and coffee left to die. Fingerprints, photos, the choreography of accusation proceeded with bureaucratic grace. Elias said little. He didn't need to. The mic said enough. By mid-morning, the charges had assembled themselves neatly. Failure to comply, disorderly conduct, obstruction, stacked like building blocks under a single name. The bailiff in Whitaker's court would call that name in less than an hour. In the holding room, a young public defender with circles under his eyes appeared with a file too thin to be useful. Mr. Carter, he asked, misreading the lack of panic on Elias's face. I'm assigned to your case for arraignment. I've seen this kind of thing go south quickly in Judge Whitaker's courtroom. Elias considered the universe's taste for irony. What would you advise? Take the plea, the defender said, swallowing hard. If he smells resistance, he'll make an example. Elias studied the man, a fighter trapped in a calendar that never forgave. Thank you, he said gently. Do your best. I'll do mine. The hallway to Whitaker's courtroom felt like a throat-swallowing light. Spectators filed in, drawn by rumor. Camera crews lingered, pretending not to be waiting for a spectacle they couldn't name yet. The bailiff's voice rang out. All rise! Whitaker entered as if he were gravity. Elias stood at the defendant's table, wrists free now, but the memory of metal still biting his skin. He kept his gaze forward, his breath measured, his posture neither contrite nor combative, just human in a room that punished humanity for forgetting its place. Name, Whitaker said, not looking up. Elias Carter, he answered, voice level. The judge's pen paused, the faintest hitch, a glitch so small it could have been imagined. Then the machine resumed. Charges read, the clerk intoned. Words accumulated into weight. The public defender leaned closer and whispered, Let me speak. Elias nodded once. The defender rose, voice respectful, arguments tight. Community ties, no prior incidents, the trivial nature of the alleged offences. Whitaker cut him off mid-sentence. Spare me the sermon, he said coolly. In this courtroom, tone matters. He turned his gaze to Elias for the first time, and a slow smile that wasn't a smile thinned his lips. Mr. Carter, do you understand what respect looks like? Elias let silence answer for him. Somewhere in that silence, pride mistook restraint for defiance. The gavel nudged the table with a soft, anticipatory tap. 60 days in county, Whitaker said, as if announcing the weather. A murmur rolled through the room, the kind that felt like electricity crawling under skin. The defender sputtered, Your Honor. Another word and I hold you in contempt, Whitaker snapped, eyes never leaving Elias. There it was, the moment the mirror turned. Elias lifted his chin, not high, just enough to let his voice carry without rising. Your Honor, he said, placing a leather wallet on the table and flipping it open so the gold seal caught the fluorescent light. For the record, my name is Elias Carter, Deputy Attorney General, Special Prosecutions. I have served in this capacity for 15 years. I am here under authority of an active investigation into systematic violations of civil rights under colour of law, and the rest did not need to be said. Shock moved through the gallery like wind slamming a door. Cameras that had pretended not to be cameras pointed like 100 eyes opening at once. Whitaker's lips parted, the colour draining from his face so quickly the room seemed to tilt. What is this? He whispered, then found volume. Who do you think? I think, Your Honor, Elias said, voice even, that the record will show what it always shows when pride is given a gavel. He looked to the clerk. Please ensure the audio feed remains preserved. We'll be submitting it to the Chief Justice's chambers shortly. In Maya's office across town, a notification bloomed on her screen as the encrypted upload began. She rose without her coat, already dialing, already moving the pieces they had arranged in the dark hours between resolve and daylight. Back in the courtroom, Whitaker gripped his gavel as if a stronger hand might make the world rewind. Bailiff, he tried, but the word arrived without authority. For the first time in a very long time, the room was not his. And for the first time in a very long time, Elias felt something close to quiet. Not the hush that follows fear, but the calm that arrives when a plan meets its hour. The oak-panelled courtroom breathed with its usual heaviness, a place where the weight of history pressed down like stone. The murmur of shuffling papers and hushed voices died as the bailiff's command cracked through the air. All rise! Feet scraped against marble. The doors opened and Judge Harold Whitaker strode in, his robe trailing like a shadow, his expression carved from the same granite as the columns around him. He did not glance at the spectators who craned their necks, nor at the cameras tucked discreetly behind benches. His eyes swept only the docket as if the defendants were irrelevant, mere names on a conveyor belt of guilt. Elias Carter stood at the defense table, hands resting calmly in front of him. He wore no badge on display, no emblem of the power he carried outside these walls. Here, he was a defendant. The cuffs had been removed, but the marks still ringed his wrists like phantom chains. He allowed himself a single slow breath, measuring the air, tasting the stale tang of wood polish and dust. This was the moment the entire plan had been designed for. The lion's den. The clerk read the charges in monotone. Failure to comply. Disorderly conduct. Obstruction of justice. The words echoed, stacking themselves into a fragile tower. Elias kept his gaze fixed forward, neither submissive nor defiant, simply present. The public defender beside him fumbled with a thin file, already sweating through his shirt. He whispered nervously, "I'll handle this. Just keep quiet." Elias inclined his head, the smallest of nods. He was ready to play his role. Whitaker leaned forward, his pale hands folding over each other, eyes narrowing. "Mr. Carter," he said without warmth, "you find yourself here because you could not follow the simplest instructions from a law officer. You believe the rules do not apply to you?" Elias said nothing. Silence stretched. The public defender rose. "Your Honor, my client is a respected member of this community, with no prior offenses, steady employment and—" "Spare me the sermon," Whitaker snapped, his gavel tapping once in warning. His eyes pinned Elias like a hawk sizing up prey. "In this courtroom, respect matters. Do you understand what respect looks like, Mr. Carter?" At last, Elias lifted his gaze, meeting the judge's eyes. He did not flinch, did not avert. "I believe I do, Your Honor," he said evenly. The response, calm as it was, only deepened Whitaker's irritation. His lips pressed thin, his pen scratching quickly across the docket. 60 days in county jail. Perhaps that will teach you what obedience means." The gallery gasped. Reporters in the back straightened in their seats, pens flying. The public defender paled. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is—" "Another word," Whitaker cut him off, "and I will hold you in contempt." The silence that followed was the silence of a noose tightening. The gavel descended with finality. Case closed. Elias remained still, his breathing steady, though his pulse pounded. This was the moment. He reached slowly into his jacket, drawing out a leather wallet. With deliberate calm, he placed it on the table and flipped it open. The gold seal glinted under the fluorescent lights. "Your Honor," Elias said, his voice carrying through the chamber, "for the record, my name is Elias Carter. Deputy Attorney General, Special Prosecutions Division, 15 years of service." The room froze. The bailiff hesitated mid-step, his hand inches from Elias's shoulder. The clerk's pen slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the desk. In the gallery, someone whispered, "Oh my God." Whitaker's face drained of color. What did you just say?" Elias lifted the badge slightly, letting its gleam confirm the truth. "I stand before you today not only as a defendant, but as an investigator. For 6 months, I have been documenting systematic judicial misconduct in this district. This morning's proceedings complete the record." The air itself seemed to buckle. Reporters scrambled for their phones, cameras clicked alive. Whitaker gripped the bench as though it might keep him from falling. This is highly irregular," he stammered. "You cannot— this is entrapment." Elias's tone remained steady, almost gentle. "Entrapment requires persuading someone to commit a crime they otherwise would not. I did nothing but comply with lawful orders. The rest was your choice, Your Honor." The gallery erupted, a storm of voices colliding. Shock, outrage, awe. The bailiff stood frozen, torn between his loyalty to the bench and the authority gleaming in Elias's credentials. Elias reached for the briefcase that had been set discreetly at his side. He clicked it open, revealing a thick folder. "For the record, Your Honor, this investigation has compiled 15 years of data. Case comparisons, sentencing disparities, audio recordings from chambers. Today, I simply needed one last piece. Your behavior toward me indistinguishable from the hundreds who came before. Whitaker's voice cracked as he tried to muster authority. This is a mockery of the court. Bailiff, remove him immediately. But the bailiff did not move. His gaze flicked between the trembling judge and the unwavering prosecutor. The silence of hesitation said everything. The spell of Whitaker's dominance was broken. Elias turned, addressing the gallery now, his voice carrying the weight of command. Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed today was not an isolated judgment. It was the latest note in a chorus of bias that has sung through this courtroom for 15 years. The State Attorney General's office is moving forward with immediate suspension proceedings. As of this moment, Judge Harold Whitaker is under investigation. A reporter called out, "Mr. Carter, did you deliberately get yourself arrested?" Elias's gaze sharpened. I provided Judge Whitaker the same opportunity he has taken with countless defendants, to reveal his assumptions about a man who looks like me. The difference is, today the defendant has the means to fight back. The cameras captured Whitaker's expression collapsing. Anger, disbelief, and finally fear. The gavel slipped from his hand, striking the floor with a hollow clatter that echoed like the fall of an empire. For the first time in 15 years, Whitaker sat speechless in his own courtroom. And for the first time, Elias Carter stood taller as the lion's den turned into his stage. The gavel still lay on the marble floor where it had fallen, a mute symbol of power slipping from trembling fingers. Judge Harold Whitaker sat frozen in his high-backed chair, the blood drained from his face, his robe suddenly looking less like authority and more like a shroud. Around him, the gallery stirred like a hive, voices whispering, reporters jostling, cameras snapping without restraint. For years, this room had been Whitaker's stage. Today, it was his cage. Elias Carter stood at the defense table, his presence transformed. Moments earlier, he had been the accused. Now, his badge gleamed under the harsh lights, his shoulders squared, his eyes hard as stone. He lifted a heavy folder from his briefcase and laid it flat on the table, each page inside weighted with lives reduced to numbers, each comparison a blade honed to pierce the armor Whitaker had built. He did not raise his voice, but his words cut sharper than any gavel's crack. "For the record," Elias said, his tone steady, almost clinical, "this file contains comparative analyses of 47 cases handled by Judge Harold Whitaker over the past decade and a half. In each instance, black defendants were sentenced to prison terms an average of 38% longer than white defendants convicted of the same offences with similar histories. The disparity in drug possession cases exceeds 50%. The gallery murmured, disbelief and fury mingling like storm clouds. Elias opened the folder, pulling out the first sheet. Exhibit 1. Marcus Williams, age 19, first-time offender, charged with third-degree assault. Sentence: 18 months in county jail plus 2 years probation. 3 weeks later, Connor Bradley, age 20, identical charge, identical circumstances, also a first-time offender. Sentence: 6 months probation, community service, voluntary counselling. He laid the papers flat so the press could glimpse the words. The public defender at Elias's side shifted, eyes wide. Exhibit 2, Elias continued, turning the page. Malik Jefferson, college graduate, no prior record, caught with a personal use amount of cocaine. Sentence: 2 years in state prison. The prosecution had recommended probation. That same week, Connor Bradley, again, same substance, same quantity, received probation and counselling. The prosecutor's recommendation was identical. The only difference was the defendant standing before the bench. Whitaker's lips moved, but no sound emerged. Elias did not pause. Exhibit 3. Kesha Roberts, a black defense attorney, objected during a domestic violence hearing. Judge Whitaker silenced her with ridicule. 15 minutes later, her white colleague, David Martinez, raised the same objection. Judge Whittaker sustained it and thanked him for his diligence. The transcript shows the words nearly identical. Gasps rose, sharper this time. Elias's voice sharpened with them. Exhibit 4. Tony Washington, public defender. His 18-year-old black client sentenced to 2 years in prison for marijuana possession. Same amount of marijuana, same charge, yet a white teenager from the suburbs received diversion to rehabilitation. Washington himself said it best, "My kid gets prison. Their kid gets a second chance." A reporter in the gallery raised his hand, his voice cutting through. "Mr. Carter, are you saying Judge Whittaker has a consistent record of racial bias?" Elias's eyes snapped to him, steel in his gaze. "I'm not saying it. The numbers are, the transcripts are, the outcomes are. For 15 years, this bench has been a weapon. And today, that weapon has finally been turned against its wielder." Whittaker slammed his palm on the armrest, his voice breaking the silence at last. "This is outrageous. You twist statistics to fit a narrative you—" Elias raised a hand, his composure unbroken. "Statistics don't twist, Your Honor. They reveal. They show what you tried to bury under coded language and feigned impartiality." He pulled another sheet from the file, this one stamped with the seal of the State Statistical Services. Independent analysis confirms these disparities. Not once, not twice, but across the entirety of your career. The numbers don't lie, but they expose the lies of those who claim to stand for justice while practicing prejudice. Whittaker's voice faltered. You entrapped me." "Entrapment," Elias said calmly, "is persuading someone to commit a crime they would not otherwise commit. You, Judge Whittaker, needed no persuasion. I complied with lawful orders. You escalated. You sentenced me to 60 days in county jail for a traffic violation that ordinarily results in a fine. That is not entrapment. That is you. On record." In real time, the clerk sat motionless, her pen abandoned, her face pale. The bailiff, usually quick to enforce Whittaker's commands, stared at Elias's badge as though waiting for new instructions from a higher authority. Elias placed another stack of papers on the table. 47 case comparisons, statistical analysis confirming the disparity. Audio recordings of chamber conferences where you referred to defendants as these people, who needed to learn discipline. 47 hours of recordings, all authenticated. This morning's hearing was simply the final piece. You provided it yourself. The gallery buzzed with intensity. Phones buzzed, cameras flashed, pens scratched furiously against notepads. The weight of the evidence pressed down on the room until it felt like the air itself could snap. Elias turned toward the gallery, his voice steady but carrying. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press, the Attorney General's office will be releasing this file to the public within the hour. Every sentence imposed by Judge Whittaker will be reviewed by an independent panel. Defendants who were victims of discriminatory sentencing will be eligible for appeal and resentencing. Justice may have been delayed, but it will not be denied." Whittaker gripped the bench as if it were a lifeline. His voice cracked into desperation. "You can't do this. I am a sitting judge. I have authority." Elias's gaze did not waver. Authority is not immunity. And respect is not obedience to prejudice. Today, you stand not as a judge, but as a defendant. Every word you've spoken, every judgment you've rendered will be weighed, not by your hand, but by the law you claimed to serve. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the frantic clicks of cameras. Whittaker slumped slightly, his hand trembling against the wood. The mighty had not yet fallen, but everyone in the room could see the cracks spreading through the stone. Elias closed the folder, the sound sharp as a verdict. "The pattern is undeniable. The evidence is overwhelming, and the era of Judge Harold Whittaker is over." The gavel remained on the floor, forgotten, as if even it refused to return to his hand. The air in the courtroom felt different now, heavier, charged, as though the building itself understood the shift. Reporters scribbled in frenzied shorthand, camera shutters snapped like small explosions, and the gallery buzzed with restless energy. Judge Harold Whittaker sat stiffly, his lips pressed into a thin white line, his gavel still abandoned on the floor like a fallen crown. He tried to summon his usual air of control, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. For 15 years, the courtroom had been his fortress. Now, brick by brick, Elias Carter was tearing it down. Elias adjusted his stance at the defense table. He no longer looked like a man accused, but like the prosecutor he was. A man accustomed to leading, to commanding attention. He reached into his briefcase once more, this time withdrawing a small black recorder. Its compact size belied the weight of what it carried. He placed it gently on the table, pressing the play button with deliberate calm. Static crackled, then a voice filled the courtroom. It was unmistakable. Judge Harold Whittaker, recorded not in public bravado, but in the privacy of chambers. "These people," the recording hissed, Whittaker's tone dripping contempt. "They think they can walk into my courtroom and demand leniency. My grandfather didn't fight in World War II, so criminals could lecture me about fairness." Gasps tore through the gallery. Even the bailiff's jaw slackened, his eyes darting to Whittaker in disbelief. The judge's face flushed crimson. This is inadmissible. Private recordings." Elias held up a hand, silencing him with the authority of truth. "Admissible or not, the world deserves to hear what you've said when you thought no one was listening." The recording continued, Whittaker's voice steady, confident, damning. "Schedule Jefferson's sentencing for Thursday afternoon. I want him to sit in jail over the weekend before I send him upstate. Maybe that will teach his family some discipline." A woman in the gallery gasped audibly. Her sob broke through the silence as she buried her face in her hands. Elias's gaze softened for a heartbeat before he returned to the judge. "That," he said firmly, "was Malik Jefferson's mother. You sentenced her son to 2 years for a minor possession charge. You engineered his suffering, not for justice, but for punishment rooted in prejudice." Whittaker slammed his palm against the bench, his voice shaking. "This is outrageous. You had no right—" Elias interrupted smoothly, his voice sharp as a blade. "The recordings were provided by Maria Santos, your former court reporter. She documented 18 months of chamber conversations, 47 hours in total. Every remark, every instruction, every moment where your mask slipped and the truth bled out." Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching feverishly. One shouted above the noise, "Mr. Carter, are you saying this was a systematic practice, not isolated comments?" Elias nodded. "Yes, these recordings demonstrate a deliberate pattern. Enhancing sentences for black defendants, dismissing objections from black attorneys, ridiculing families in the gallery. It is not bias hidden behind coded language. It is explicit, undeniable discrimination, captured in your own voice." He pressed play again. Another clip echoed through the room. "I don't care if Morrison graduated summa cum laude from Harvard. Put him away for 2 years. Maybe his friends will learn something." A ripple of disgust spread across the spectators. A young man in the back whispered fiercely, "That was my brother's case." His words carried, a shard of lived pain piercing the record of cold evidence. Whittaker's composure collapsed further. "You can't, this is illegal. This is a violation of privacy." His voice cracked, desperation spilling through. Elias's reply was measured, merciless. "You violated the privacy of every defendant who entered this courtroom, stripping them of dignity and rights. You mocked them, you punished them, you turned justice into a personal vendetta. Maria Santos risked her career to reveal the truth. And now that truth stands as tall as these walls—" The bailiff shifted uneasily, as though reconsidering every command he had ever obeyed under Whittaker's voice. The clerk's hands trembled as she scribbled notes she knew would become history. Elias pressed play once more. Whittaker's voice sneered through the speakers. "These families, they cry, they wail, but discipline is what they need. They should learn their place." The room erupted, outrage, fury, grief colliding into a single roar. Reporters shouted over each other, cameras flashed non-stop, and the gallery's whispers swelled into a wave of condemnation. Elias raised his hand, commanding silence. Slowly, the noise subsided, though the tension remained electric. His voice carried with unshakable authority. 47 hours of recordings, 47 hours of evidence that you, Judge Whittaker, wielded your bench not as an instrument of justice, but as a weapon of prejudice. The people of this state, the defendants you condemned, the families you humiliated, they will hear your words. They will know the truth. Whittaker sank back into his chair, his face ashen, his authority crumbling before the eyes of those who once feared him. His gavel, still lying abandoned on the floor, seemed to mock him with its silence. Elias closed the recorder and placed it atop the stack of case files. The numbers showed the pattern, he said firmly. The recordings reveal the intent. Together, they paint the full picture. This is not just misconduct. This is a systematic abuse of power under color of law. The gallery buzzed again, but this time the voices carried hope, the possibility of justice where there had been none. For the first time, the walls of Whittaker's courtroom echoed not with fear, but with the sound of truth finally spoken aloud. And for the first time in 15 years, Judge Harold Whittaker had nothing left to say. The sound of the last recording still hung in the courtroom like smoke after an explosion. Every ear had heard Whittaker's voice, every eye had seen him shrink into his chair, and every pen in the gallery raced to capture the downfall of a man who had once ruled this chamber with absolute confidence. For the first time in his long career, Judge Harold Whittaker looked less like the arbiter of law and more like a man waiting for the ground to give way beneath him. Elias Carter stood tall at the defense table, hands folded calmly before him, the recorder still sitting on top of the damning pile of evidence. His badge glinted faintly in the fluorescent light, a symbol no gavel strike could silence. He knew the next moment would not belong to him, but he had set the stage. All that remained was for the final act to begin. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a heavy groan. The murmurs in the gallery died instantly, replaced by the sudden scrape of chairs as people half rose, unsure whether to remain seated. Two figures entered first, federal marshals in dark suits, their movements crisp and efficient. Behind them came a woman with a folder tucked firmly beneath her arm, her stride steady, her presence commanding. Agent Monica Rodriguez of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Flanking her was Assistant Attorney General Karen Webb, her briefcase clasped tightly, her gaze sharp as a hawk. Whittaker's face drained further, beads of sweat forming on his temple. "What is this?" he demanded, though his voice cracked with a weakness no one had ever heard from him before. "Who authorized this intrusion?" Agent Rodriguez spoke first, her tone crisp and unwavering. "The United States Department of Justice, Judge Whittaker. As of this morning, you are under federal investigation for systematic violations of civil rights under color of law." The gallery erupted again. Gasps, whispers, the frantic clicking of cameras. Reporters leapt to their feet, aiming microphones forward like weapons of truth. Elias remained composed, allowing the moment to wash over the room. This was no longer his fight alone. It had become national. Assistant Attorney General Webb stepped forward, unfolding the document she carried. By authority of Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, you are hereby charged with conspiracy to deprive persons of their civil rights, abuse of judicial authority, and violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The words fell like hammer blows. Whittaker gripped the bench, his knuckles white, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly before he found his voice. "This is outrageous. I am a sitting judge. I demand respect. You can't just walk into my courtroom." Rodriguez cut him off, her voice sharp. "This is no longer your courtroom. As of 10:45 a.m., you have been suspended from judicial duties pending the outcome of federal proceedings. You will step down from that bench immediately." The bailiff, who had spent years obeying Whittaker's every barked command, looked from the judge to the federal agents. For a moment, The weight of two allegiances hung in the air. Then, slowly, the bailiff stepped back, his silence declaring where his loyalty now lay. Whitaker's eyes darted around the room, seeking support among the clerks, the attorneys, the faces in the gallery. But none met his gaze. Where once there had been fear, now there was only contempt, relief, and the hunger for justice. Elias's voice, calm as ever, broke the silence. "Your Honor, former, this was always inevitable. Power can shield injustice for a season, but the truth has a way of breaking through. You believed no one would dare challenge you. Today, you discovered otherwise." Whitaker slammed his palm against the bench, the sound hollow. "You'll regret this, Carter. You think this spectacle will last? I have allies. I have protection. This is a witch hunt." Assistant Attorney General Webb raised her voice, firm enough to slice through his protest. "The only witchcraft here is the illusion you cast for 15 years. An illusion of fairness while you practiced prejudice. That illusion is gone." She signaled to the marshals. The two men in dark suits moved forward, their steps echoing on the marble floor. One carried cuffs, the other carried paperwork. The room seemed to hold its breath. Whitaker recoiled, his voice breaking into a plea. "Wait, this is a mistake. I was tough on crime, that's all. I demanded order. The community expected it." Elias stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Whitaker's. "No, Harold. You demanded obedience from those who looked like me while granting mercy to those who looked like you. That wasn't order. That was prejudice dressed in robes." The marshals reached the bench. "Mr. Whitaker," one said firmly, "please stand and place your hands behind your back." The gallery gasped again, a collective intake of breath as the unthinkable unfolded. Whitaker, the man who had once sat in judgment over thousands, slowly rose. His robe hung awkwardly on his frame, suddenly too heavy. He shook his head, his lips trembling. "I am Judge Whitaker," he muttered, voice desperate. "I am the law in this district." "No," Elias said quietly, but loud enough for all to hear. "The law outlives men who abuse it." The click of the cuffs echoed like a verdict. Whitaker flinched at the sound, his shoulders sagging as the marshals secured his wrists. The robe that had symbolized his power now made him look small, diminished, just another man caught in the machinery he had twisted for so long. Agent Rodriguez read him his rights with deliberate clarity. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." The irony was not lost on anyone. Whitaker, who had denied fairness to so many, was now receiving the very rights he had mocked and trampled. The gallery's silence broke into scattered applause, tentative at first, then growing, echoing through the chamber like the beginning of a new song. Elias closed his briefcase, the evidence inside now in federal hands. He looked out at the faces in the gallery, families of defendants, young attorneys who had been silenced, reporters who had chased rumors but never proof. His voice carried one final time. "This is not just about one judge. This is about restoring faith in a system that must belong to everyone." Today, justice began its work. The marshals led Whitaker from the bench, past the very people he had dismissed for years. His eyes flicked to Elias one last time, full of bitter recognition. "I should have known," he whispered hoarsely. "You were too calm." Real defendants break. Elias met his gaze evenly. Real prosecutors don't break at all. They build cases, and with that, Harold Whitaker disappeared through the doors, no longer a judge, no longer untouchable. The applause grew louder, rising like thunder, filling the space once ruled by fear with something it had not held in a very long time: hope. The applause still rattled through the courtroom long after the marshals led Harold Whitaker away in cuffs. It wasn't a steady cheer. It rose and fell like waves, sometimes swelling with fury, sometimes breaking into disbelief. Some spectators clapped until their palms burned, others wept openly, and many simply stared, wide-eyed, at the empty bench where the judge had once sat. For 15 years, that bench had been a throne, Now it looked like an abandoned chair. Elias Carter stood quietly, his briefcase locked at his side, his badge tucked back into his pocket. The show of force was finished. Now came the harder part. He scanned the room, noting the faces. A young man in the back row whispered furiously into his phone, no doubt relaying every detail to family outside. An older woman with graying hair dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, her lips trembling as if she couldn't quite believe what she had just witnessed. In the front row, a teenage girl held her mother's hand tightly, her eyes fixed on Elias as though he had just pulled her family from a storm. Reporters surged forward the moment the marshals closed the doors. Microphones thrust, questions fired like arrows. "Mr. Carter, what happens to Whitaker's past rulings? Is this the beginning of a federal purge? Did you risk entrapment to get this outcome? Are other judges under investigation?" Elias raised a hand, and the room stilled enough for his voice to carry. "Every ruling Judge Whitaker issued is under review. Every defendant sentenced in this courtroom will have the right to appeal. Independent panels are already being assembled. This is not entrapment, it's accountability. And yes, the investigation is broader than one man. Justice will not stop at these walls." The reporters exploded with more questions, but Elias closed his briefcase with finality. "That's all for today. The evidence will speak louder than I can." He turned, pushing through the throng, his composure intact. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaos. Protesters and supporters had mingled into a restless crowd. Some held signs painted hastily. "Justice for Jefferson. Review every case." And bias is not law. Television vans lined the curb, their satellite dishes stabbing into the grey sky. Police formed loose lines to keep the crowd from surging up the courthouse steps, though their eyes betrayed no urgency. Many of them had served years under Whitaker's authority too. Perhaps they too were reckoning with what they had witnessed. As Elias descended the steps, microphones were thrust toward him again. He kept his head high, his words deliberate. "This is not victory. This is the beginning of repair. For too long, people walked into that courtroom expecting justice and found something else. Today, the mask was removed. Tomorrow, we begin rebuilding trust." He reached the waiting car where Maya Delgado leaned against the passenger side, arms folded, eyes sharp. She opened the door for him, her voice low so only he could hear. "Congratulations, you just toppled a king." Elias slid inside, setting his briefcase gently on the seat. "Toppling is easy," he said quietly. "Rebuilding is the hard part." That evening, the city pulsed with reactions. Every news channel ran the footage, looping the moment Whitaker was cuffed, Elias's calm reveal, the thunder of applause. Talk radio buzzed with callers, some furious, others elated. Social media exploded with hashtags. Justice unmasked. Whitaker exposed. Carter protocol. In neighborhoods long shadowed by Whitaker's rulings, families gathered in living rooms, watching the footage over and over. Some cried with vindication, others with relief, others with bitterness for years already lost. Malik Jefferson's mother sat on her worn sofa, clutching the remote. On the screen, her gasp in the courtroom replayed again and again. Her son, still behind bars, called her that night. "Mama, did you see?" he asked, his voice trembling. She pressed the phone to her chest and whispered, "Baby, we're finally being heard." At the state attorney's office, staff worked through the night. Case files piled high on conference tables. Naomi Parks scrolled through spreadsheets, her eyes burning with exhaustion, but lit with determination. "We've already identified 143 cases with statistically significant disparities," she reported to the team. "And that's just the first sweep." Sarah Martinez, Elias's deputy, shook her head. "That's hundreds of lives altered. Jobs lost, families broken, futures stolen." She tapped the stack of files. "We're not just fixing numbers. We're stitching lives back together." Naomi adjusted her glasses, her voice softening. "Some wounds won't heal. But giving them truth, that matters. Meanwhile, Whitaker's allies scrambled. At the exclusive country club where he once held court over brandy and cigars, whispers filled the dining room. Some muttered about loyalty, others about self-preservation. A senator who had once toasted Whitaker's commitment to order now spoke in hushed tones to aides about distancing himself. Protection evaporated fast in politics, especially when cameras caught the fall. In a quiet suburb across town, Whitaker himself sat in a holding cell, his robe exchanged for a plain jumpsuit, his hands gripping the edge of a narrow cot. His lawyer, pale and nervous, tried to reassure him. "We'll argue entrapment, Harold. We'll challenge admissibility of the recordings." But Whitaker shook his head slowly. "They heard my voice," he whispered. "You can't unhear a man's truth." His lawyer said nothing. The aftershock spread beyond the city. Editorials ran in national papers. The New York Times headline read, "Judge exposed, a reckoning for the courts." On cable news, pundits debated whether Elias Carter's tactics were brilliant or reckless. Civil rights leaders praised the boldness, while legal scholars dissected the precedent it might set. At a law school lecture hall the next day, a professor played the footage for her students. "This," she told them, "is history being written in real time. Watch closely. This is what courage looks like when institutions fail." Back in his office, Elias stared at the growing wall of case files, the sheer volume staggering. Maya entered quietly, carrying 2 coffees. "The city's calling you a hero," she said, setting 1 cup in front of him. Elias didn't look up from the papers. "Heroes don't have this much paperwork." She smirked faintly. "You realize you changed the game today. People will call this the Carter Protocol." He paused, finally glancing at her. "Names don't matter. Results do. I don't want another Whitaker sitting behind a bench unchecked. If the protocol helped stop them, then maybe the risk was worth it." Maya studied him for a long moment. "You put everything on the line, Elias. Your career, your reputation, your freedom. Was it worth it?" Elias leaned back, exhaling slowly. His eyes drifted to the window, where the courthouse loomed in the distance, its columns still bathed in floodlights. "Ask me again, when Malik Jefferson walks free. Ask me again, when Marcus Williams gets his life back. Ask me again, when every defendant who sat in that courtroom has their record reviewed. Then I'll know." That night, as the city buzzed, Elias sat alone in his office. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving only the quiet hum of the desk lamp and the distant sirens outside. He opened a red folder labeled Personal Impact. Inside were letters from families. Photographs of young men in graduation gowns, now wearing prison uniforms. Handwritten pleas from mothers who had begged for fairness and been met with disdain. He read one aloud softly, his voice breaking. "Judge Whitaker looked at my son like he was garbage. 2 years. In prison for something a white boy got probation for. Same crime, same amount, same everything. Except the skin he was born with." Elias closed the folder gently, his hand lingering on the cover. He whispered into the empty room, "Not anymore." By dawn, the city's skyline glowed with a new light. For some, it was just another day. For others, it was the first day in years they felt hope. The aftershock of Whitaker's fall had rattled the walls of power, but it had also opened doors long bolted shut. For the first time in a generation, people believed that maybe, just maybe, justice was possible. And for Elias Carter, sitting with his briefcase beside him and a wall of cases before him, the work had only just begun. The sun rose over the city in muted gold, but inside the state attorney's office, the lights never went out. The corridors buzzed with the shuffle of paralegals carrying boxes, clerks racing with files, analysts poring over data until their eyes blurred. Whitaker's downfall had cracked open a dam, and now the flood of cases poured in with merciless force. Elias Carter stood at the head of the war room, a cavernous conference space where every wall was papered with charts and timelines. Rows of names stretched across whiteboards, marked in red and blue. Red for defendants sentenced disproportionately. blue for those already flagged for appeal. The air smelled of dry erase markers and stale coffee, the aroma of revolution disguised as routine. Sarah Martinez entered with a fresh stack of reports, dropping them onto the table. "That makes 279 confirmed cases," she said grimly. "And that's just Whitaker." "We're still finding patterns in neighboring districts," Naomi Park followed, adjusting her glasses, her laptop tucked under her arm. "Preliminary analysis suggests Whitaker wasn't unique." 3 other judges in the state showed disparities almost as severe. Different patterns, same outcomes. She hesitated before adding, "We may be looking at something systemic." Elias leaned forward, bracing himself on the edge of the table. His eyes scanned the numbers, but he already knew what they meant. "Then Whitaker wasn't an aberration," he said quietly. "He was a symptom." The room stilled, the weight of his words pressing down. Maya Delgado broke the silence. "So what's the play?" "We can't storm every courtroom in the state. And you can't get yourself arrested again just to prove a point." A faint smile tugged at Elias's lips. "No, once is enough. But now we have a model, data, recordings, first-hand demonstration. We build it into a protocol. Every district, every judge. We turn the same scrutiny." Whitaker faced into a nationwide standard. Naomi nodded, her analytical mind already running. "We could formalize it, statistical reviews, independent oversight, undercover evaluations if necessary. A blueprint for accountability." Sarah scribbled furiously on a notepad. "Call it the Carter Protocol," she muttered. Elias shook his head. "Names don't matter. Results do. If people trust the system again, call it whatever you like." The first test of rebuilding came sooner than expected. That afternoon, Elias was summoned to a press conference at City Hall. The mayor, flanked by police chiefs and community leaders, addressed a room packed with reporters. The cameras swiveled as Elias stepped onto the stage, his presence commanding even without words. The mayor spoke first. "In light of Judge Whitaker's removal, all his cases will be reviewed immediately. A task force led by Deputy Attorney General Elias Carter will oversee the process. We owe it to our citizens to restore faith in the justice system." Then she stepped aside, yielding the microphone to Elias. He scanned the sea of faces, reporters, activists, families of defendants, and let the silence draw taut before speaking. For 15 years, this city lived under the shadow of one man's prejudice. Today, we step into the light. Every unjust sentence will be reviewed. Every family will have their voice heard. And every judge who thinks they can wield the bench as a weapon should understand. Your time is running out. The room erupted in applause. Yet Elias saw the wary eyes of officials in the back, men and women who knew their own records might not withstand the same scrutiny. For every cheer, there was resistance waiting in shadows. That night, resistance found its voice. Elias's office phone rang, the caller ID blocked. He answered anyway. A low voice slithered through the line. "Careful, Carter. You think Whitaker was the only one? You've made enemies who wear robes and sit higher than you can reach." The line clicked dead before Elias could reply. He set the receiver down slowly, his jaw tight. He'd expected this. For every family cheering in the streets, there were judges and allies who saw him as a threat. Rebuilding was not just about fixing old wounds. It was about surviving the backlash. Days bled into weeks. The Carter team worked around the clock. Files stacked high, every one a story. Malik Jefferson's case was overturned. Marcus Williams received a gubernatorial pardon. Dozens of families walked into the courthouse, trembling and left with tears of relief as convictions were vacated. But with each victory came headlines of fury from Whitaker's allies. Editorials accused Elias of conducting witch hunts. One op-ed sneered, "Prosecutor plays God, decides which judges fall next." Anonymous letters arrived at the office, some calling him a savior, others promising vengeance. Maya handed Elias one such letter late one evening. He read it silently. "Step back, Carter. or you'll find yourself the one on trial." He folded it calmly and slid it into a folder marked Threats. "You're not rattled?" Maya asked. "Of course I'm rattled," Elias admitted, "but fear's a compass. If we're over the target, we'll take fire." The turning point came when federal officials announced that 2 more judges were under investigation, both exposed using methods inspired by Elias's plan. A national magazine ran a cover story with his photograph and the headline, "The Man Who Put Justice on Trial." Elias hated it. He wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. But when he visited a church basement where families gathered to discuss appeals, a little boy tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Carter," he whispered, "my dad's getting a new hearing because of you." Elias knelt, looking the boy in the eyes. "No, son. Because of the truth. That's what set him free." The boy smiled shyly, and Elias knew the protocol had to spread further, faster, no matter how heavy the burden. Behind closed doors, however, pressure mounted. Senators called the Attorney General, warning of political consequences if investigations expanded too far. Judges whispered about refusing cooperation. Elias himself was summoned to a private meeting with senior officials. One leaned across the table, his voice sharp. "You're destabilizing the judiciary. Be careful, Carter. If you make the system look corrupt, people may stop believing in it altogether." Elias met his gaze without flinching. "The system isn't destabilized because I exposed corruption. It was destabilized because corruption existed. My job isn't to protect illusions. It's to protect people." The official scowled. "Idealism is dangerous at your level." "Then let it be dangerous," Elias replied. The rebuilding was messy, chaotic, exhausting. But slowly, the scales began to tip. Judges who had once ruled with unchecked authority now glanced nervously at their transcripts, aware that every word, every disparity, could become tomorrow's headline. Public defenders walked into courtrooms with renewed confidence. Families dared to hope. Late one night, as Elias reviewed the day's progress, Naomi approached with a hesitant smile. "You know," she said, "law schools are already teaching this. They call it the Carter Protocol." Elias shook his head, closing the file before him. "It's not about me." Naomi tilted her head. "Maybe not. But symbols matter. For the first time, young lawyers are learning that the system doesn't have to stay broken. That matters." Elias looked around the room, at the boxes of files, the whiteboards covered in red and blue, the weary faces of his team still burning with resolve. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a small, genuine smile. "Then maybe we're rebuilding more than a system," he said softly. "Maybe we're rebuilding faith." 6 months after Harold Whitaker was led from his courtroom in chains, the city looked different. Not in its skyline, those marble columns and glass towers stood unchanged, but in its pulse. The courthouse that had once symbolized fear for black families now carried a different weight. Possibility. Where whispers of injustice once haunted its halls, there was now the steady hum of review panels, clerks working overtime, and families streaming in with lawyers who no longer carried resignation in their eyes. Elias Carter's office on the 15th floor of the Attorney General's building had become a command center. The wall behind his desk was plastered with maps, case charts, and timelines. A line of red pins marked districts under investigation. Blue pins marked those where reforms had begun. What had started as a local reckoning had expanded into something national. Sarah Martinez entered with a thick folder, dropping it onto his desk with a weary grin. Malik Jefferson, complete exoneration. Court-ruled bias was undeniable. He's free, record wiped clean. Elias opened the folder, scanning the ruling. For a moment, the war room felt lighter. "Good," he said, his voice low. "That's one life restored." "Not just one," Sarah replied. "Marcus Williams too. Governor signed his pardon yesterday. He's applying to law school." Elias looked up, a rare smile flickering across his face. "Law school?" Sarah nodded. "Said he wants to fight for kids like him. Said you showed him how The words settled over Elias with unexpected weight. He had fought for statistics, for fairness, for systemic repair. But hearing that someone who had once been broken by the system now wanted to join it, wanted to mend it, that was legacy. National attention had not faded. The Washington Post ran a feature calling the Carter Protocol a revolution in judicial accountability. Law schools built seminars around it. Civil rights organizations adopted it as a framework for reform. In state houses across the country, legislators debated bills requiring statistical audits of judges' rulings. But the spotlight was not all praise. Conservative pundits railed nightly, calling Elias a vigilante with a badge. Editorials accused him of eroding judicial independence. On one televised debate, a commentator sneered. He didn't save justice, he put justice on trial. Elias rarely watched. He had no time for rhetoric, but sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he wondered whether the critics had a point. Could exposing corruption so publicly weaken faith in the system? Or was the faith already gone, and his work only revealed the cracks people had long pretended not to see? The answer came not from politicians or pundits, but from people. One evening, Elias attended a town hall at a community center in the South Side. Families packed the room, some holding photos of sons and daughters still fighting appeals. A woman stood, clutching her husband's hand, tears streaking her face. "My boy spent 3 years in prison because of Whitaker," she said. 3 years we can't get back. But now his case is being reviewed. Mr. Carter. For the first time, I feel like someone listened. Elias's throat tightened. He had spoken in courtrooms, press conferences, boardrooms filled with suits. But here, in the raw presence of grief and hope, he felt the true measure of his work. He nodded once, his voice steady. "I can't give back the years, but I can promise you this. No one will ever ignore those years again." The applause that followed was not the frenzied clamor of reporters or the cautious cheer of politicians. It was something deeper, gratitude, fierce and unpolished. Back in Washington, federal agents expanded investigations. 3 more judges were suspended, their rulings under review. The Justice Department announced a national initiative modeled directly after Elias's work. A headline blared, "Carter Protocol goes federal." Naomi Park briefed him one morning, her laptop glowing with fresh data. 17 states have adopted mandatory judicial audits. 5 federal districts are piloting undercover evaluations. And law schools are flooding us with requests for training materials. She paused, adjusting her glasses. "This is bigger than you, Elias. It's movement now." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment. Bigger than him. That had always been the goal. Yet the idea of becoming a symbol still felt strange. He was a prosecutor, not a prophet. But perhaps the line between the two blurred when institutions failed and individuals were forced to step forward. Not everyone celebrated. Resistance stiffened. A coalition of judges filed a lawsuit challenging the legality of statistical audits. Political allies whispered about stripping Elias's office of authority. Anonymous threats arrived weekly, letters, calls, even a shattered window at his townhouse one night. Maya Delgado confronted him after the incident. "You need security, Elias. You're too exposed." He shook his head. "I'm not hiding behind guards. The moment I do, I become another untouchable. That's what we fought against." She glared. "This isn't about ego. It's about survival. You can't rebuild the system if you're dead." For once, he had no answer. The true test of legacy came 6 months after Whitaker's fall, when Elias was summoned to the state Supreme Court. A panel of justices wanted to review the Carter Protocol itself, to determine whether it had a place in formal law. The chamber was packed with attorneys, lawmakers, and press. One justice, stern and skeptical, leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, do you understand the precedent you've set? Prosecutors orchestrating their own arrests, judges suspended based on data analysis. This is radical. Why should we trust this process? Elias rose, his voice steady but passionate. Because the old process failed. For 15 years, Whittaker operated unchecked. Complaints vanished, appeals died, families suffered. The system you ask me to trust ignored its own rot. The Carter Protocol doesn't weaken the judiciary, it protects it. By shining light, by demanding transparency, by refusing to accept disparity as normal. If we can't measure fairness, we can't guarantee it. The chamber buzzed with murmurs. The skeptical justice tapped his gavel lightly, then sat back. No verdict was given that day, but the tide was shifting. The very fact that the highest court debated reform proved the old silence was broken. That night, Elias returned to his office. The city lights sprawled below, glittering like constellations. On his desk lay a simple wooden box. Inside, the broken gavel Whittaker had dropped when his authority collapsed. Elias had kept it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Maya entered quietly, watching him turn the splintered wood in his hands. "You still think about him?" she asked. "Not him," Elias said softly. "The hundreds who sat before him. The lives he bent. This gavel doesn't belong to him anymore. It belongs to them." He set it back in the box and closed the lid. Some symbols are stronger when they're broken. Months later, Elias recorded a video for the Justice Department's public channel. He sat at his desk, the city skyline behind him. 6 months ago, he began, I stood in a courtroom accused as a defendant. In truth, I stood as a prosecutor. I orchestrated my arrest to reveal what many already knew but could not prove, that justice had been twisted by bias. That day changed my life, and it changed this system. He paused, his eyes steady on the camera. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Institutions fail, but people can rise. Justice is not blind unless we insist on keeping her eyes closed. When we demand accountability, when we measure fairness, when we refuse silence, then justice works. He leaned back slightly, the faintest smile tugging his lips. And when justice works, freedom follows. The video spread across the nation within hours. Some mocked, some cheered, but for thousands who had lived under shadows, it was a call to believe again. Elias Carter closed his laptop that night, exhaustion finally overtaking him. Outside, the courthouse gleamed in the moonlight. A new judge now presided there, Patricia Nguyen, a woman with a reputation for fairness and rigor. Early reports showed disparities plummeting under her watch. Elias allowed himself one final thought before sleep. Whittaker had fallen, but the system had survived. And in surviving, it had begun to heal. His legacy was not the fall of one man, but the rise of an idea, that justice could be held accountable. And as long as that idea lived, the fight was not in vain.